Hi kids, it's time for the Bible and You. And today's episode is, I hope you enjoyed the last 12 episodes and I'm really happy to see you again in episode 13. And as I said in the previous episode, from this episode on we'll be looking at the book of Hebrews chapter by chapter. So today we'll be looking at Hebrews chapter 1. And I won't go through it, I won't read each verse as we go along, but I will explain what the verses are trying to convey. And if you can take some time and read through the chapter yourself after you watch this video, it will be really helpful for you. So, as I mentioned in the last episode, the book of Hebrews is a letter that was written by an unknown person to Jewish believers who were facing persecution and imprisonment for their faith. And the author opens the book in the first few verses by introducing Jesus to the readers. And he opens this by saying that in the past, God spoke to our forefathers through prophets, but in these last days, God speaks to us directly through his Son. And then he goes on to explain that Jesus is the Son of God, but he is God in human form. And he does this by using two metaphors. First, he says Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, and then he says Jesus is the express image of God's person. And what these two metaphors mean is that the radiance of God's glory, as I explained in the previous episode, is if we think of God as the sun, then the rays that come off of the sun would represent Jesus. That's what he means. And if you thought of God as a seal, then the imprint from that seal would represent Jesus. So what the author is conveying here is, yes, Jesus is the Son of God, but he is God himself. You can't really separate the two of them. And then from here on, the author starts talking about, for the rest of the chapter, he explains how Jesus is better than angels. And he uses a lot of prophecies from the Old Testament to make this, to prove the point that Jesus is better. And so what I'll do first is I'll go through the verses where these prophecies are mentioned, and I'll tell you the Old Testament reference where this prophecy comes up. And then I will go through each of these reasons and I will explain how they show that Jesus is better than angels. So the first reference to a prophecy is made in chapter 1 verse 5, and there are two prophecies in this verse that relate back to the Old Testament. So let's look at what they are. The first one says, "You are my son." And the first time this verse is mentioned in the Bible is in Psalms chapter 2 verse 7. And then the author uses another prophecy that says, "I will be his father." And God is the one speaking here, and he's speaking to Jesus. And so what he's saying is that God will be his father. And this comes up in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 14. And then in chapter 1 verse 6, we read, it says, "Let all of God's angels worship him." And this comes up for the first time in Psalms chapter 97 verse 7. And then in chapter 1 verses 8 and 9, he says, "Your throne lasts forever." And this is another prophecy from Psalms chapter 45 verses 6 and 7. And then in chapter 1 verse 12, it says, "Your life will never end." And this again is taken from a prophecy in the book of Psalms chapter 102 verses 25 to 27. And then in chapter 1 verse 13, God tells Jesus, "Sit at my right hand." And again, this is another prophecy taken from Psalms chapter 110 verse 1. So there are a lot of Old Testament prophecies that the author uses to remind the readers that Jesus actually fulfilled all of the Old Testament prophecies about him. So remember that this letter is written to Jewish believers. So these Jews knew exactly what prophecies the Old Testament had about the coming Messiah. So for them, when they read these verses, they would have realized that, yes, okay, so this is what we know about the Messiah, and this seems to match Jesus exactly, which is what the author is trying to do. He's trying to make that connection between the Old Testament prophecies and Jesus, and to prove to them that Jesus is the Messiah. So that's the first part. And he also accomplishes the second point here. He proves to the readers that not only is Jesus the coming Messiah, he's also greater than angels. And this is the second part that we're going to go through now. So in each of these prophecies that I mentioned, there is something mentioned about Jesus that makes him unique and better in many ways than angels. And that's the list that we're going to run through now. So if you look at chapter 1 verse 4, it says, that Jesus was given the name of Son. And God never called any angel his son, but he calls Jesus his son. And so because Jesus is called the Son of God, he is better than angels. That's the first reason. And this is further confirmed by the prophecies given in chapter 1 verse 5, where he says, "You are my son and I will be your father." And then in chapter 1 verse 6, it says, "Let all of God's angels worship him." And the angels are asked to worship Jesus, which means Jesus is clearly better than the angels. So that's the second point. The first thing is Jesus has the name of Son, and the second point is that the angels worship Jesus. That makes Jesus better. And the third point is that he fulfilled the prophecy that his throne will last forever. So Jesus will always remain king. But none of the angels have this privilege. It's only Jesus who has this privilege. And so that makes Jesus better than angels because his throne will last forever. Again, in chapter 1 verse 12, it says, "Your life will never end," which means Jesus does not have a beginning and an end because he is the creator of all things. He is God himself. So everything in this world, including you and me and all the angels and all the creation, has a beginning and it also has an end, right? So everything is born and then it dies. So the world was created, but it'll be destroyed one day. But Jesus is the only one who does not have a beginning or an end. Even the angels have a beginning because God created them. But Jesus always existed, which makes him better than angels. And then in chapter 1 verse 13, God tells Jesus, "Sit at my right hand." Again, this refers to Jesus having a throne, basically meaning that Jesus is a king and he sits at the right hand of God. And God never asked any of the angels to sit at his right hand. He only asked Jesus, which makes Jesus better than the angels. And finally, at the end of the chapter, the author closes the chapter by saying, "Angels are sent to serve those who are heirs of salvation." So here he's talking about us. So we are the heirs of salvation. We are the people who received salvation by believing that Jesus died for us on the cross. And so he's saying here that angels are actually sent to serve. So they are sent to be servants to those who believe in Jesus. But Jesus is the one who saved us. So he's clearly greater than angels. So that's all of the first chapter of the book of Hebrews. So 2 points to remember here is Jesus fulfilled all of the Old Testament prophecies about the coming Messiah, and he also, all of these prophecies put together also show us that Jesus is much better than angels. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have any questions, then please email them to this email address given below. Please subscribe to our channel, Church of the Living God, and I hope to see you again in the next episode. Bye!